Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started. And I'm Noor Bchara. I'm the founder of Upcycled Design School and also Noorism, which is a repurposed denim brand. And Upcycled Design School, it basically offers classes about upcycling and sustainability for fashion and similar areas. And so you can check Upcycle Design School out at upcycledesignschool.com. And right now I have Upcycle Design Masterclass. And so I'm excited to do this Upcycled Jewelry Workshop with Danielle Keller Aviram. And so she is one of my former students from Upcycle Design Masterclass. She's based in Berlin and she has her master's in sustainability, and she's founded a jewelry line and also done consulting for companies since she got her master's. And so Danielle, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'm really excited to, although it's online, virtual, I'm really happy to see some familiar faces, but also meet some new people. So as Noor mentioned, it's a collaboration between Noor and her masterclass about upcycling fashion, and kind of like shift the focus today a bit towards jewelry and what does it mean to do upcycle jewelry. Before I'm gonna start my presentation, I would really encourage you to ask any questions in the chat box because we're gonna have some time for questions in the end. So if there are some things that you want to ask but you don't want to forget, so make sure to write them in the chat. Before we're gonna dig deeper into the topic of upcycling in jewelry, I'm gonna do a quick overview of the jewelry supply chain and kind of like the sustainable issues around that, because I'm not sure all of you are well aware of that. So yeah, we're gonna start right there. So I hope that now you can see my screen as well. Yeah, so what we're going to have today, we're going to talk briefly about the jewelry supply chain. And from that, we're going to go more into details about the different impacts created by jewelry production and design. Then we're going to go and highlight some of the main differences between jewelry and fashion items in general, but also when we talk about upcycling. So this has a tight connection to how we can then translate or transform used jewelry into new jewelry. Then we're going to highlight some opportunities for change, how we can use upcycling to create positive change. And then how are we going to transform these opportunities into action? So what does it mean when you want to actually make upcycled jewelry? We're going to talk a bit about sourcing from different industries and what opportunities and challenges come with these kind of situations. Of course, we're going to talk about challenges when implementing upcycling. And I'm going to give few examples from around the world of interesting brands that are doing upcycled jewelry. I think that the main thing that is important during all of this journey when you deal with upcycling, and I'm sure that Noor can agree on that, is communicating the story, because the story of upcycling is a really unique one. It gives the product something really special, that products that are made from new materials, they don't carry the story onwards. So this is definitely something that we're also gonna highlight. So the jewelry supply chain. So as all other industries, the jewelry supply chain is also linear at the moment. So it means we use raw materials. In this example, we use metals and stones. They come from the ground in a raw form. Then they are processed and become these more shiny materials that we know from jewelry shops. At this point, starts the design and prototyping process. So we plan how the product is going to look like by using sketches, but also 3D programs. And during this process, we also do some quality control and some few checkups before we move to mass production. And when we are using mass production, there are different techniques. We can use 3D printing, casting, but also some parts are handmade. Then after the items are made from metal, usually they are set in stones and get polished. And just after that, we see them in the shop. So there are a lot of different steps that each item passes before we meet these shiny items. Yeah. So now when we are talking about the jewelry supply chain, and we have a brief overview, we're going to talk about some of the issues, the sustainable issues coming from these kind of processes. So when we're talking about the material level, so just about the rough metals and stones, we're talking about issues associated with corruption, conflicts, and civil wars in different places around the world. There are a lot of issues around human rights abuse, extensive energy use to transform these materials from rough or raw situation into a processed one, high chemical use, air contamination, soil use and contamination, biodiversity loss, since a lot of these sites that produce that are mined to use these materials are in rural areas, so close by to nature and to animals. There is no traceability, so we don't know most of the materials. We don't know where they actually come from. And there is heavy water usage, and as a result of chemical usage, a lot of pollution. When we're talking about the design phase and the product development phase, these items are designed for short-term use. So there is no thought about how they're going to be look like in 10 years, and sometimes not even 5 years. Again, there is no traceability. So when we design, we don't think about where things come from and maybe reflect the origin in how things are designed. There is a lot of material waste, and there are some issues around workers' well-being. In the manufacturing level, again, some of these issues, of course, occur in all the steps. Again, traceability and transparency is a big issue. Workers' well-being, some of these production sites are not based in Western countries, and the manufacturing is audited or monitored by third parties or subcontractors, and workers are impacted as a result of that. There is an extensive use of energy, heavy chemical use, and chemical waste. Again, water use and pollution, water pollution as a result of water used in many production steps. A lack of waste management system. So a lot of these scraps are just end up as waste. Air contamination, since some of these production processes involve chemical usage that afterwards leaks into the air that workers work in. And there is a lot of material mix that prevents these materials from being reused. When we talk about the retail operation, so in this case, we talk about the product life cycle level, there is no really recycling system for all jewelry materials. Again, a lack of waste management system. So there is no plan in which how these materials could be used again. And again, we have no traceability. So we don't know anything about the materials and where they come from, where they pass through, who touched them before us. So the main differences between fashion and jewelry, I don't know, maybe some of you are familiar with this butterfly diagram by Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So when we're talking about fashion, fibers for garments are either coming from the biological cycle, so they are grown in ground, they are based on plants in most situations, or coming from animals. And there are materials or fibers that are coming from the technical cycle, like polyester, that it's not biodegradable. It comes from the ground, but in a form that it can't disappear in nature. When we are talking about jewelry, all of the materials in the jewelry industry, even the fashion jewelry, they are all coming from the tech cycle. So nothing can biodegrade. It means that when you finished wearing your nice fashionable jewelry earrings and you toss them into landfill, they are not going to disappear. They are going to stay above ground until forever. There are some estimations that are talking about the fact that actually all the gold that ever mined since the beginning of humanity is still above ground. And we are talking about something like 200,000 tons of gold. And they are still somewhere around us. So this is one of the main big differences when we're talking about jewelry and fashion. Other differences, as I said, all jewelry materials are made using from materials from the technical cycles. And all the minerals that ever mined are still somewhere around the planet. Jewelry materials can't be composted or reinserted back to the soil. So this means that it makes even more sense to reuse these materials and upcycle them. Jewelry materials were perceived precious since old time. This made recycling to a certain extent in the industry a more common process. So gold, you can see a lot of gold, or not a lot, some of the gold that you sell as your old gold can be recycled again with silver. But this is true to a quite small amount out of the gold that is used worldwide. And this is definitely not true to all metals used. This is still a quite niche process that is done in the industry, although it makes sense that it would happen in a much more bigger scale. And it's important to highlight at this point that the common materials that are used for jewelry, like minerals, it doesn't matter if it's stones or metals, they could be recycled and reused endlessly without impacting the material quality. So basically, we could melt any metal again and use it again for new jewelry. We could polish old stones to create new jewelry with old stones. And it's not that an old diamond is going to look worse than a new diamond, for example. The jewelry industry in general has less collections per year compared to the conventional fashion brands. Usually there isn't any like autumn and then winter and then spring and then summer, and sometimes like a resort collection and a pre-fall. There is no such thing. Usually there are 2 collections a year, and some houses create specific collections for the holiday season, for example, or some full holidays in the area where the brand operates. Until like actually not that long ago, jewelry items were passed between generations. So usually a grandma or a mother would pass on her fine jewelry to her children or grandchildren, because jewelry was in a lot of situations carrying messages, social status, and it was inherited in a way that it carries its importance. It's an item like a talisman. It can protect you from bad things. It's associated with ceremonies and big events. Still today, although sustainability becomes more and more big topic, that people are aware of the impacts of our plastic and our fashion and our food, with jewelry, this is yet the situation. Most of us all are not aware of the negative impacts caused by the jewelry industry. Some of you might remember the big discussion in the beginning of 2000 about blood diamonds in Africa, and Leonardo DiCaprio and his movie around the blood diamond industry in Africa. And although some things have changed, there are still a lot of these kind of issues popping up in the jewelry industry constantly. And this is just a fraction of the all issues that are coming. Minerals that are used in the jewelry industry, and this is something important because maybe it can even expand the scope of reusing and upcycling. So a lot of minerals that are used in jewelry are also used in many other industries, like finance, electronics, and so on. So a lot of these industries use gold, use silver, use other fine metals. Some of them even use diamond dust. So it makes even more sense to maybe create even this bigger planning of how we can reuse materials. Now when we're talking about upcycling and what does it mean for jewelry. So I wanted to start by this brand called Article 22. And they operate in Vietnam, but they sell their products all around the world. And it all started from two ladies that went to travel in Laos and Vietnam and discovered that actually Laos was really affected by the Vietnam War. And there were more than 250 million bombs dropped on Laos in the Vietnam War. 80 millions out of them haven't exploded. So it means that they are still somewhere around the soil of Laos. And besides the fact that they are contaminating the soil, it means that when there are floods or rain, these bombs move around. And the communities in Laos after the Vietnam War, they were really poor, but they still needed some things. So when they found these bombs, they started creating from these bombs items like pans and spoons. Few decades afterwards, these two ladies came to Laos and they were really amazed by the culture of reusing and recycling items. On the other hand, this is really dangerous because these bombs contain also explosives, and this could be really dangerous. So they created a collaboration with an organization that is operating in war zone areas. They disassemble the bombs, and then from the metals that surround the bombs, these artisanal communities in Laos creating jewelry. And every bangle, according to them, clears 3 square meters of bombed Laotian land. And I thought that this is a great story if we are jumping to the end of this presentation, because besides the fact that maybe you're helping some country on the other side of the world get rid of their traces of war, this is a great example of reusing materials into something really good. And you are part of this when you purchase this bangle. So how can we transform these opportunities into action? So we're going to focus now in a brand called Kled from LA. They use used glass for their jewelry. And basically, they process this glass, they cut and measure the different parts of glass, they melt the glass into different shapes, they sand and polish it, and just after that, they assemble everything into items. I found it really interesting because they tell their story in a nice way. They say that they wanted to establish a brand, a jewelry brand, but they didn't want to use any new materials. And they liked glass and the different shades that it can create. And they thought that it could be a more accessible way if you compare it to precious stones. And in the beginning, they started using their own like cosmetic bottles and wine bottles and beer bottles. But at some point, they ran out of glass bottles around their houses and they started collecting from friends. And after a few weeks, this also ended. And then they found themselves digging through garbage bins to find glass bottles. And at some point, they were like, this is too crazy. We're not going to continue digging into bins to find materials that we are going to use into our jewelry. So they built a few partnerships with local restaurants and bars. These restaurants and bars collect for them used wine and beer bottles. And then every few weeks, they just transport the used bottles. So these restaurants get rid of waste, so they don't need to pay more waste taxes for getting rid of these beer bottles and wine bottles. And this brand get their materials locally. Then, of course, they do the same process as we saw in this slide. They cut the glass, they melt it, they polish it, and assemble it into items. And when we talk about upcycling jewelry, basically, as I said before, this could be made from whatever we want, like any material that we can imagine. So of course, this could be made out of textile. So in the example that you see from the left, you see a brand called Cherished Objects. They build partnership with vintage seller, sourcing from them luxury textiles. So sellers that got leftovers of luxury fabrics that they're not going to sell because they have like few meters or the end of the roll or something like these. And these are all vintage. So sometimes these are things that are not trendy anymore or they don't fit the style. But this brand, they create small items, scrunchies, small fabric bags, all made out of these vintage textiles. And the piece you see in the picture is handmade out of a collected vintage Liberty from London silks from the 40s and 70s. So their items are always mix of a few textiles together. On the right, you see Tanith, upcycled jewelry example. She started making these bangles from her old denim items. She didn't know what to do with them, and she thought that this could be a valuable material because she had a pair of pants, a big one, but she could make out of a pair of pants a few bangles. When she understood that this has a potential, she started sourcing all denim from secondhand stores, and this became bigger and bigger. And it doesn't mean that it needs to contain metal, like in this example. It could also be completely textile-based jewelry. We see today from new materials, jewelry made out of materials that are not including metals at all. Another interesting example called Fremd Format from Germany. They used upcycled metals for their jewelry. The brand, based in Heidelberg in Germany, it's a center for industrial metal workshops and factories. So, and they intentionally decided to open the brand there because they wanted to reuse metal scraps. And this is why they built partnerships with local factories, and they sourced from them all the industrial scraps that they could get, like offcuts for making jewelry, but also offcuts from other items. And from these offcuts, they create their own production. And again, like the metals that these factories and workshops use might not mined in Germany, but at that moment they were in Germany, so it made more sense for them to source their materials locally from factories that are near them. And it means that when they run out of materials, it's easier for them to source again and again. So some of the challenges in implementing upcycled jewelry. As I said, upcycled jewelry can be made of everything from used paper to old watch materials, anything that you can think about. So one of the main problems is if we compare it especially to fashion or like to upcycled fashion, there isn't any organized system collecting and sorting used jewelry or used jewelry materials. So there aren't any second-hand shops that sell only used jewelry. There aren't any rag houses. But on the other hand, in the examples that we already saw, there are a few other potential opportunities there. Used jewelry items, unless made from really fine materials, don't have a material content hang tag. This makes it sometimes hard to upcycle or recycle because we don't know actually what it contains, from which materials it's made, if there are any glues involved, if there is anything that maybe if we heat it, it might break or explode. So this can make also some production problems when we are trying to upcycle or reuse these items or materials. And again, when we want to create upcycling used jewelry, it can take some time to find sources. And it sometimes can be hard to know which kind of items you would get. But in the examples that I already showed you, the brands intentionally from the beginning planned their brand in a way that it would make it easier for them to get constantly material flow into their brand. It can be time consuming to build these partnerships with factories and businesses or other brands, and just in order to use their scraps. But on the other hand, this could also mean that you would need to spend less money on buying materials and sourcing materials. And it can be even easier because some of these partnerships could be local, close by to where you're based or where you work. Again, if we're going back to infrastructure, there aren't any online platforms which you can source specifically used materials for jewelry. There are some of these for fashion. So if you are creating upcycled textile jewelry, you can base your sourcing on these kind of platforms. But for other materials, there aren't any online platforms for that as well. And transforming some of these used materials into jewelry can be complicated and energy extensive process. So it makes sense to make sure when you start developing a product and plan it to make sure that you know what you're doing. Similar to what Kled in LA did with their glass jewelry. Manipulating scraps and materials into jewelry quality materials require high design and execution skills because some of these materials are going to be waste. So it means that you really need to use design and product development skills in order to see the potential in these materials. Now we're going to go into a few more examples. So I wanted to share with you Radical Jewelry Making. It's a community project operated mainly in the US. And it's part of, as part of the project, they collect used jewelry from the community. They go to different universities and communities, and then they ask the community to bring used items, used jewelry items. Then jewelry and artisans from the community transform these new items into custom-made transform these old items into custom-made new items. This project is a really good example of how you can use education, because this project is done jointly with local communities. So how you can use education, consumer education, but also jewelers and artisans education into thinking more and more about reusing jewelry materials and about upcycling. And this is a great example of urban mining. So basically you don't go to a mine to source these materials, you go to a city to source these materials. And if any of you is interested, they have a toolkit in their website that is open for teachers from universities and whoever is interested. And it's definitely worth checking them out. A few other examples from around the world. So we have SVNR from New York. They make one-of-a-kind jewelry items from found, reused, upcycled, and natural materials. And they try to source everything from New York City. And they, according to what they say, part of the unique part or the unique story of their items is the fact that there is only one out of everything. There might be some materials that you would see again and again in different items, but the exact item is specifically for you. Another interesting brand is Ludmila Navarro from Spain. She collects different materials from plastic toys, glass, crystals, metal scraps, ceramics, everything, and then mixes them all together. And she collects all of these items mainly in flea markets around Europe, and she creates these really extravagant items. And again, in this situation, it's completely one-of-a-kind items. But these are all things that she combined in a really unique and beautiful and creative way. The example in the right is called Circuit Breaker Labs. It's also based in the US, a brand based in the US. They produce jewelry from old computers, mobile phone, calculators, monitors, and other electronics. And they found the beauty in these items. So when they opened up these electronic devices, they saw these beautiful patterns and beautiful colors, and they used these kind of patterns and colors in their jewelry without adding any more additional things. And it's their way of repurposing e-waste again to something useful. So now I'm going to talk really briefly about communicating the upcycled story. I think that especially in the last few years, people are looking for more interesting things when they buy something. They are less and less looking for something that is generic or that everyone has. And a story could be something really important when we're talking about selling a product or marketing a product. And when you make products from upcycled materials, something that was old and not used, and then you create new life for that, it has a really strong story. Knowing what this item was before is a really interesting and unique perspective. So there are two examples of some items that I created. And basically I used old garments that I had and I didn't wear them anymore. And I thought that I was a student, I didn't have any money, but I needed to create a project. So it made a lot of sense for me to just use what I have. This used to be a jacket and I manipulated it. I disassembled the parts. And I also worked on the textile to create something that wouldn't be so similar to the original item. And this used to be a sleeve and became kind of like a collar. Yeah, so I'm going to leave the last 10-15 minutes for some of your questions. And I'm gonna also check if there are ones written in the chat, but feel free to raise your hand or open your mic to ask some questions. And once you have a question, make sure to say your name so I would know who to refer to.
Danielle?
Yes.
Hi, it's Mickey from Shankar, Israel.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Good. Maybe we can go back to the screen.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
not this screen. The unshare the screen.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, now I can see you. Yeah. I was wondering, actually, very interesting. This the whole presentation really and made me. It really opened my mind because jewelry is always a very small thing. No, it's like almost insignificant in material. I come from textiles, so the volumes are much bigger and the impact is quite big. So I was wondering really if we have any idea of the volume of I don't know how much gold or how many diamonds if any are being recycled or upcycled. That's the one thing. Is it such a big deal? Is it really is the quantity that big? And does it really happen? I mean, really, I mean, these kind of materials. I know that you mentioned that in cell phones and electronics, we have very, very valuable minerals and stone and you know and metals. Are they being recycled? Is there any real movement?
Yeah.
And that's one minute, and another question, and that's it. How is I mean, I know that the valuable stones and such are a traditional part of jewelry. Is the world really changing towards upcycled jewelry from materials that are not initially valuable? That's it.
So in terms of your first question, I think that I would divide the answer into few parts. First of all, in recent decades, there are more and more prediction about the scarcity of these materials. So it becomes harder and harder to actually mine these materials from the ground. Companies need to dig deeper, and this requires much more infrastructure, machinery, of course, energy. And it actually becomes harder to find mines that it's worth to even dig in. And there are a lot of predictions talking about that in approximately 100 years, we wouldn't have more gold. And there are some predictions, I don't remember exactly, but for silver and platinum and other minerals that are commonly used in the jewelry industry. And this goes the same to diamonds. With color stones, I'm not so sure because it's a bit different industry and infrastructure, but we can talk about that afterwards.
Okay.
And the weird thing is that there are some recycling aspects that are happening in the jewelry industry. So, for example, if I would give an example, when you cast an item from metal, all the scraps from the casting process, the in-house casting process, could be recasted again and again and again. But on the other hand, these casting houses, they wouldn't accept you bringing old silver or old gold that is not theirs. So the refining process of old metals is done elsewhere in shops and sellers that are buying old metals. Usually the incentives to sell your old precious metals are much lower than buying new gold. So this definitely impacts the whole recycling system. Recycled stones barely happens if you're talking about vintage items that are then being resold. Usually the stones, unless they are extremely big in an extremely high quality, which is really rare to find with vintage items, usually they would just toss away the stones, or they would calculate what is more valuable and not trying to repurpose everything. Yeah. In terms of scale, of course, it's smaller. The jewelry industry is definitely smaller than the fashion industry, but it has a big impact, I think, especially because these products are not going to disappear at all. Like polyester is quite new fiber. Until polyester, we used only biodegradable fibers, which means that even when you go to like custom, like the Met, and you see like old textiles, some of them are like in boxes, protected from like with a specific air quality and humidity, so they wouldn't disappear. With jewelry, this is definitely not the issue. So everything is somewhere here between us. And I think that it makes it even crazier not to use it, because it should be easier than mining, you know, digging extremely deep holes into the ground with like extensive machinery and with a lot of energy. This is supposed to be easier. But the industry is yet incorporating this process. I forgot the second question, so maybe you can repeat that.
Maybe I'll let someone else ask.
Okay, so I will see if there are some questions in the chat. Are there extra costs associated with upcycled jewelry compared with non-upcycled jewelry? It's hard to say because it really depends on which kind of materials you work with. But I think similar to upcycled fashion, once you source used materials, you would need to take care of them. You would need to clean them, sanitize them. In the example that I gave of Kled, the jewelry brand with the made from the glass, they do a lot of different production processes in order to transform the glass into jewelry items. And I think this is similar to a lot of the examples that I gave. But it's hard to say if it's more, if there are any extra costs comparing to using raw materials or new materials. Yeah, I think it really depends what kind of materials you use and where you source them. Yeah, if there are specific questions about specific materials, we can definitely highlight these kind of materials. Yeah, let's see if there are more.
So in addition to that question, you were talking about mining raw materials and how there's limited amounts of raw materials left on Earth to be mined. So what are the cost differences using precious metals that are upcycled versus mining raw materials? Because perhaps, is it more the perception of people not wanting to upcycle jewelry versus the costs associated with it?
Yeah, actually, I think in terms of cost-wise, this must be cheaper, but at the moment, because it's not a commonly used process, the price difference is not existing. And there, I think Mickey was saying something about metals and other precious materials also in different industries. And there are some recycling minerals from electronics, for example, happening. But at the moment, from what I know, this is still a really complicated process and a really toxic process. And it's not yet economically viable. So it's not really happening. Although there are a lot of news items about e-waste sites all around the world being piled with more and more electronics. And some of these items definitely contain precious materials that we could use. Yeah. Yeah. Besides this, yeah, I think it's definitely not, as I said, like there would be some recycling, but only in-house in casting facility. So it's not across industry, something that is exchangeable. I don't know if it makes sense, or should I explain it again? Like usually a factory would recycle its own scraps, but they wouldn't accept scraps from outside.
So perhaps also in the case of precious metals, jewelry, a big aspect of upcycling and making it more sustainable is to just change perception and bring more awareness. And not, so with fashion, there's a higher cost associated a lot of times with upcycling fabric or garments, and perception and changing the way the public feels about it. But with jewelry, it sounds like perhaps a big aspect of making it more popular, it's not the cost at all. It's just changing the way people look at it and changing perception.
Yeah, so I think that definitely change of perception, both in industry and in consumer awareness, because I think that a lot of people, for some reason that I still don't completely understand, perceive recycled metals as less valuable. There are a few surveys around that, that for some reason consumers are willing to pay less for recycled precious metals. Although from quality control perspective, it doesn't impact at all. Like it has the same characteristic, the quality is the same. In terms of long lasting, it acts the same. So there shouldn't be like this, it's a bit of, I don't know, knowledge gap or something like this, that people are not aware and the industry is not trying to change it, because at the moment there is no interest to change people perception. Yeah. Yeah, I don't see any more questions, but if there are more questions, it would be great to hear them in the last minutes.
I have a little question.
Yeah.
And it's not fully formed, so feel free to expand on it. I guess my question when thinking about, we're jewelers and do a lot of custom designs and processes. But I guess in thinking about the jewelry industry, and I guess in fashion too, I guess the question that comes up for me with upcycling, which I love, is accessibility and I guess quality control. So I guess, can you speak a little bit to that? Like how, I guess how to work with that, either with like buying vintage jewelry and then trying to assess the quality and then repurposing it, or I guess with like your the vintage silks example you used, like how do they kind of keep that supply up so they can kind of keep up with demand with that resource, I guess?
Yeah. So what the Cherished Objects is doing is they build few partnerships with textile sellers of vintage fabrics. So people that already have this infrastructure, so they already sourced these materials, they know where to source them once they're finished. So it's easier for them to know that they have, when they need, they have a constant material supply. In terms of jewelry, I didn't dig deep into vintage jewelry, but I know that there are vintage jewelry sellers all around the world. I know that in the US, it's really well established. I think I even know one guy that is selling vintage stones, but I can look it up, that this is what he does. And I think there are a lot of people that could estimate the quality of vintage jewelry and its materials. And I think that in today's situation, these materials are not, or like when you go to disassemble an old jewelry, because this is a process now that is in mind to be done as fast as possible and not thinking about the full value of all the materials, extracting out of that the most. It's kind of like, let's do it fast because we get cheaper price for the gold or cheaper price for the silver, so we need to do things quick. Then a lot of materials in the middle are getting discarded. But I think that once this process is done, maybe in a bit different system or in a different structure, you could actually get a lot out of vintage items because you can reuse the stones. Some of them have like old polishing shapes, but you can repolish stones and then repolish them in today's standards. So, creating the clarity, color, all of the gradings that you would need for customers today. And the same goes to metals. So when you disassemble all the materials in a way that is delicate, then you could reuse everything. So I would assume that the easiest way would be to find dealers that sell vintage items and build a partnership or relationship with them, and then you would know that they would notify you once they get something valuable. Or but maybe also reaching out to your customers and saying that if they have old items, maybe they can bring them back and you can repurpose what they already have. This is quite an easier way, because then it might also encourage consumers to use what they already have at home. But yeah, it's part of the challenges that I highlighted, that the infrastructure is not yet existing. So yeah, if there is maybe a last question, we could use the last few minutes before we wrap up. There is a comment here about traceability of recycled metals. In the UK, it's becoming more and more common actually to use recycled metals in fine jewelry. But the traceability is definitely an issue also with recycling metals, because there is yet a system to trace back where things came from before it was refined. And this is something that I know that now there are a few startups using DNA sampling and another technology that I don't remember at the moment to trace back to the mine. So they sampled a lot of common mines around the world. So when they do a scan of the DNA of the different materials, they can match them to know where the origin came from. But this is yet quite a niche solution, like a startup-y solution that is not yet common across the industry, but it's definitely a possible answer to traceable issues, because once you have a bank of all the samples of the soils of mines around the world, you could have kind of like what the police has when they take blood samples from, sorry for the bad analogy, but it's a similar mechanism to match between the mine site and what the item that you have at hand, and then kind of like finding traceability not based on story and people passing information from another, but based on exact measures and information. So if there aren't any questions, I would say that we would finish for today. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have more questions or you want to discuss this topic more into details, feel free to contact me also on LinkedIn, by email, in Instagram, whatever. I would be happy to answer any of your questions. And we're gonna have, like, this session was recorded. So if you wish to get the recording or any recap information about the session, we're gonna send it to you. And if you want to share it afterwards, we would be also happy. And thank you very much, Noor, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you everyone for coming. And like she said, this session has been recorded. It's going to be uploaded onto YouTube, and we'll be sending a follow-up recap post about it and email. So looking forward to that. And thank you so much, Danielle. This was so interesting. And thank you guys for sharing those links in the chat, and keep in touch.